backgrounds and cultures you represent. Incredible resource. So I'd like to pause and ask you to give yourselves a round of applause for what you as an audience represent in this room. Thank you. Well, we've had a chance to hear 3 approaches to dialogue so far. We've talked about dialogue in an era of democratic fragmentation. We've talked about pathways to peace and the role of dialogue. And lastly, the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue. What I'd like to close today's session with is an overarching proposal about the role of dialogue in Hizmet in this phase that we've moved into subsequent to 2016. And this is a chance for something new to come in how Hizmet volunteers and participants understand ourselves, and also at the same time, an importance of holding on to what first defined the movement many, many years ago. That would be the core thing I want to communicate with the timer running in less than 15 minutes. So we face a challenge with those 2 terms that I just mentioned. First, increasingly, religion is seen not as the glue that holds a society or nation together, but as a source of division. How is Hizmet to serve as a source of unity, given that it arose in Turkey, was culturally Turkish, and was inspired by a gentle, wise Muslim imam, Fethullah Gulen? I come from a country where religion is now being used to dichotomize the nation which used to say one nation under God. And now, if you're evangelical, then for you, increasingly that means that you support a particular political party, a particular man, and whatever that man is saying. The other side is said to have lost its Christianity altogether, the progressives or liberals, and to have descended to a sort of weak-kneed Marxism, such that now this one gentle prophet, Jesus, has as a heritage 2 politically warring groups, which in threatening the stability of the United States, threaten global stability. Did I put that strongly enough? Right? So that's part of the challenge. At the same time, here's the challenge. Hizmet now presents itself as a transnational civic society initiative, which takes away the fear that it works to evangelize or to push Turkish self-interest around the globe. On the other hand, that phrase doesn't warm the heart the same way as friendship dialogue did. How do we handle this new situation that we face? What I want to do in the remaining 13 minutes is to talk about the 3 phases of Hizmet's history and to try to locate where we are today and how we should move forward, particularly in the area of dialogue. Phase 1 brought these 5 types of activity: service, interfaith work, friendship, dialogue, and a focus on multicultural and multi-religious dialogues. What I'd like to do is to focus in on the example I know best, the Pacific Institute in Southern California, where I've been involved for the last 14 or 16 years. Now, we began with Turkish activities. So the Anatolia Festival would draw us about 45,000 people to a fairgrounds in Orange County every year. And people were drawn by the richness of Turkish culture and history. Then they began to engage in friendship dinners and other activities of Hizmet in Southern California. There was a strong draw to that. In the next phase, we moved on to interfaith friendships and friendship dinners. And I want to say that I know these primarily from the standpoint of bringing together leaders in a state. So in Colorado, in California, in Hawaii, in Alaska, in Wyoming, other states, the governor, many of the senators and representatives would come to a Hizmet dinner. And those were powerful. As a non-Muslim participating and speaking at these events, I realized what it was that made Hizmet so successful in reaching out in this form of friendship to people who had probably never been invited by a Muslim to a meal before, period. One was the people in the room, the Hizmet volunteers, the friends were so warm and welcoming, it was contagious, especially to a room full of politicians who are always trying to get something from someone else, right, tit for tat. That was one. The second one is they were clearly not evangelizing. They weren't pushing Islam. They were honoring the Christians and Jews in the room. And the third reason that was really clear is that the work that Hizmet volunteers did in that state was known by its leaders as supporting law enforcement, civic engagement, volunteerism, work with those neediest in society. That representation by Hizmet members, I can say from 7, 8, 9 different state governments, was powerful and transformative. A lot of those people then ended up going to Turkey and strongly supporting the work of Hizmet in that area. The Ramadan dinners, iftar dinners have also been and continue to be in the US, as probably in other countries as well, powerful means of connecting. Look at the way that the Mosaic Multicultural Foundation described itself. First of all, multicultural foundation, harmony through dialogue, incredible way to describe it, and spoke of the friendship dinners as contributing to the progress of intercultural and interfaith dialogue and peace. That's the branding of phase 1 in Islam in the United States, and incredibly effective, as you may well know. Now, how do we respond to a radically new situation? It takes perhaps some new techniques, but also not losing the first ones. So this is the phase after the crisis, pictures and stories that many of you know only too well, when a military coup was blamed on a peaceful imam living in Pennsylvania and used as an excuse for incredible movement of persecution for Hizmet. Schools were closed, institutes were closed, massive universities, charitable organizations, assets were stolen from the people to whom they belonged, and at one point, over 50,000 people were imprisoned, as well as migrating to leave Turkey. That began this transition to Hizmet as a transnational civil society initiative. And what came out of that was the attempt to describe 12 values that civic society organizations can contribute to the common good of a nation, a people, a region. What this did was to take away the fear, actually to answer the challenge that Hizmet might have contributed to violence or political overthrow by saying, look, here are the values we actually represent. And those were presented in different ways, listing with descriptions. Many people worked with Alp and many other volunteers in formulating these at the time. In order to humanize them, then, we attempted to give an overall understanding. Dialogue is still written in large words, but here, the primary focus is on social cohesion, how Hizmet can contribute to the cohesion, the working together well, peacefully, of a group of people in any nation of the world. The mutual understanding, the person-to-person dimension, was not emphasized in that list so much. So we redid them to personalize them with pictures of people involved, but the same very general values were listed. Okay, Clearly, it was important to focus on shared values, things that are shared across multiple religions and that help to be the glue that holds a society together. At the same time, this was a much more difficult product to offer in the building of relationships between human beings, religions, and culture, which is why I had you applaud yourselves in the beginning. So here you can see the more general set of values that became part of this second phase in the history of Hizmet. You can see, again, here they're listed at the top part, but look at the last sentence in the first paragraph. Concepts rooted in Islamic tradition and universal human values. You could say that the shift was to that latter phrase, and that the grounding in Islam was de-emphasized in this phase. Again, for reasons that made a lot of sense at the time. I agree that we can't go back from the 12 values. But how can we emphasize the deeper beliefs and values that motivate the work? Where is the role of service? And this is what I think leads us to the third phase, interfaith friendship and shared service as our contribution to civil society. Do you see how I'm trying to bring the two phases together? As actually in the previous session, Alp signaled that that work is actually already underway. So my proposal is to think of the expression, the motto maybe, rooted in faith, active in the world, in service of all. A social movement guided by the deeper values of Fethullah Gulen, of the history, and rejoicing in the resources that other faith traditions bring to that same dialogue. And what I want to do now is to just sort of remind you of the way that we spoke in the first part of the tradition, the sorts of expressions that were transformative for my life and the lives of many religious and non-religious people around the world. I think the reminder is important before I close. So compassion comes first. Imam Gulen said, the universe is woven out of compassion. What brings created things their essential beauty is compassion indeed. Humankind, compassion comes first. Depolarization we've heard a lot about already. But look at the religious reason for it. All knowledge belongs to God, and religion is from God. How then can the two be in conflict? I mean, there is a simple wisdom that communicates across cultures and nations and languages in that way of thinking. The third is democracy. Our challenge is to strengthen democratic institutions. He actually argued it's the only viable political system for humans today. A stronger statement than I'm hearing from the United States, for example. On terrorism and violence, a sentence I will never forget, and it should be on all of our websites. Terror can never be used in the name of Islam or for the sake of any Islamic ends. A terrorist cannot be a Muslim, and a Muslim cannot be a terrorist. We are representatives and symbols of peace. And finally, dialogue between the religions. I'll let you read it. That became the central focus. And so what I'd like to do in closing is to flesh out this proposal, rooted in faith, active in the world, in service of all. Why do we need to emphasize faith foundations? Because that's the living, breathing, human, divine side of the work. We can add to civil society that warm heart side of why we do what we do. So we use language of civil society movement, but we can emphasize that we're motivated by our faith as Muslims and Christians, as Hindus and Jews. We're not merely the one, but they're the product of a deep faith that lies at the core of our being. So the proposal, we can be more forthright about our religious motivations. Think about expressing the entire ladder of values. The values we live out in everyday practice, linked to the values in a city or nation, the core values of civil society, the 12, and then look at the root. The foundation are the religious foundations, the divine foundations for the actions that we take. The 12 principles by themselves don't sing, but when we add to them the sacred texts and stories of Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and the texts of religions around the world, that draws the hearts of human beings. And finally, to show how we derive the values, and then we come as persons of faith to the civil society dialogue. Not suddenly finding ourselves with 12 universal values, but with our faith, our culture, our race, our national background, our own personal histories. That's the richness that we bring to that shared point. So the ladder of values, we need all four as they work together. And even with universal values, it's still about faith, about human beings, as we've heard in these stories, about children and adults, about contact, and in the end, about love and compassion. Thank you very much.